welcome to Arkham. What's Arkham, you say? Well, golly gosh, if it isn't the top tourist hotspot in New England. Oh, see how they are flocking in. Meet the locals and experience the joys of the city. See how this fellow marvels at the sights. Why, yes indeed, get the whole family involved. Perhaps you're a fellow who enjoys the arts. Well, between the theatre and the town's very own resident of the magnificent Horatio, you couldn't ask for more. Not to mention the fact that we're home to the world-renowned Miskatonic University, a hub of knowledge and learning for all of New England's most ambitious students and learned scholars. Our library has one of the finest collections of books around.
Or perhaps you just want to enjoy the atmosphere,
while indulging in a little of the town's renowned copperhead whiskey. But if none of that catches your eye, there's plenty more to see and do. So come on down to Arkham and enjoy.
Stygian is a game that absolutely drips atmosphere. It's a Lovecraft RPG set in the town of Arkham, which rather unfortunately has been sucked into another dimension and is now stranded, you included. You're haunted not only by the literal terrors just wandering around, but also the Dismal Man, an entity floating around in your dreams, and you have to pursue him. The exact reason as to why is up to you. It's a good game that takes you, the character you play, and the source material very seriously. And it clearly possesses many qualities that can make it an outstanding RPG. Developed by Cultic Games, it's an indie product, and that has unfortunately been a factor playing against the game. Like oh so many indie titles, they aimed for something they couldn't really fully realise, and that has left as much of a mark on the game as all its positive attributes. But that said, there's still plenty here to enjoy. So, character creation is important to all RPGs. And Stygian does this well. There are a number of classes to choose from, all with a selection of subclasses that come with an extra positive at the cost of a negative. Once you've made your choice, you can pick a belief system, which is an interesting roleplay mechanic we can get into a bit more later. You can also pick out your stats and perks, which is fairly typical of an RPG. Life will come at you fast in Arkham. One minute you're an occult detective, waking from a bad dream full of dancing and murder, then putting on your trench coat and fedora and getting ready to face the day. Then you're being called a cuck, reconsidering the fedora, psychologically abusing the crazy man for cash, and seeing people get torn to bits by dogs. Truly, it's a wonderful life. Although the town is in rough shape, it is still functioning. Authority in Arkham has defaulted between two powers, the cult and the mob, who seem to have an uneasy peace going on. But stores still try their best to function through the madness, selling all the things you might need to survive. In fact, the bar is positively normal. Thing is, people have decided that money is a bit old world, and now they want to barter with cigarettes. Seems unwise basing your economy on an object people burn up for recreation, but what do I know? I thought for a long time the mob and the cult were going to amount to something more than they did in the actual story, but they're really there to be more thematic for the setting. They add a lot to the atmosphere, but across the story you don't advance their positions or affect their standing in the world in any real way, although several quests will have you interacting with them. But the residents of Arkham extend beyond the major players. Unfortunately, very few in town are quite sane now. For example, unless you can talk him out of it, the antiques guy is only interested in keys. The drugstore owner is wantonly cruel, and the gun shop owner has a kind of hard edge to him that makes the mob just adore him. And that's not even considering the truly mad. It's not subtle, but it's tremendously fun and thematic. By this point you've probably noticed the art style. It's got this hand-drawn aesthetic, and the streets seem dark and grimy. Everything's filthy and decayed, but it's not overdone. The colours themselves are muted, but the art design keeps things full of character. Mind you, the animations can be a bit clunky. When it comes to story and game structure, the quests are tightly confined around the central narrative, which is actually fairly short. There are a handful of side quests, but none of them really have a huge impact anywhere. They are written to a very high standard, and so many of the objectives can be approached in different ways. Just as a very basic example, near the beginning of the game, you're going to have to take down a wall. The detective can analyse the wall to search for weaknesses, scientists can utilise chemicals to break down the cement, or failing any class-specific option, you can pay the mobsters outside to do it for you, with a discount if you're charismatic enough. It's great, and really makes you feel like your skills are contributing to a unique character. In dialogue, you can make choices based on your skills as well, which unlock new outcomes, and they aren't constrained to just the use of speech skill checks. Medicine, psychology, science, and the occult all get opportunities to shine, as well as many others. That already makes the roleplay in Stygian better than it is in Fallout 4. Your class and skills can also affect things outside of dialogue. A scientist can craft junk into useful items, for example, going into the dark, electric headlamp for your kerosene lamps to improve fuel efficiency, and infrared goggles negate any darkness drawbacks. Got a perfectly good gun? Turn it into a crossbow. Remember, intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. Can't quite convince the thugs next door to keep it down? A cultist can send in the spectral cavalry to drive them away. Combat proving to be a bit too tough? Learn how to spit acid and simply terrify your opponents into fleeing. The path always leads to the same destination, but how you get there is up to you. Sooner or later, you're going to get into combat. Unfortunately, it's quite unavoidable, even for the most charismatic of characters. It's a turn-based grid system that's quite slow to play, and it can have a lot of randomized elements to it, especially if your sanity is snapped. You can panic or break from combat, causing you to miss turns, which is hellishly annoying. But just like in real life, hard drugs and alcohol can steady your nerves before a big battle. A very interesting mechanic, though, is to not see a fight all the way through, but instead use the progressive retreat system. Regular retreat zones are marked, normally against the edge of the zone from which you approach. Stand your character here and you can retreat from combat. However, do sufficient damage to the enemy, and other marked hexes will appear on the other side, always positioned just behind the farthest back row of enemies. This allows you to duck out of a fight early, but still gain the EXP as if you have won, and continue to make narrative progression. It's a neat system which stresses the fact that combat isn't necessarily the goal. It's more of a brutal reality you just kind of have to deal with. Sometimes running past is the best option. However, it is a system that sometimes falls down. There are mandatory boss battles that cannot be skipped or ran past. Only a few across the game, true, but it's enough to sink the aspirations of a charisma or stealth-based character from completing the game without fighting. Still, with a party at your back, you shouldn't have too much trouble. They can carry a lot of the combat if they must. You can have up to 2 companions at a time, who have limited abilities on level up, and unique skills which work to lock them into a few archetypes consistent with their character. But that doesn't stop them from being pretty strong and patching up any holes you have in your martial skill set. There are very few available companions. 3 can be obtained by just about everybody, with some skill checks. But 2 are locked to specific archetypes. The butler for the aristocrat, and the dog for the explorer. The 3 core companions, however, draw heavy inspiration from Lovecraft and his works. There's the outsider, a character lifted wholesale from one of Lovecraft's novels, which shares the same name, his real-life wife of a few years, and the undead soldier is apparently inspired by the short story Herbert West Reanimator. I like them. You can stop to have a chat and get to know them, and from time to time they will react to the ongoing situation and have something to say, especially the outsider. For someone so distrusting of others, he sure is a chatty fellow. Only problem is, their skills are a touch situational. In combat they can expect to be more useful, that's always good, but their other skills are only really employed in a pre-camp task function. Upon resting, you get the opportunity to dish out a few chores to yourself and your party. Companion skills can help here, such as the outsider's ability to understand the occult and learn new spells, but most of them are made redundant, especially if you're staying at the inn, and a party's skills don't contribute to any dialogue checks. That's all on you. For some bizarre reason though, when you dismiss or change a companion, you can't ever get them back. Some will hint at the idea that they are waiting for you somewhere, but you'll never be able to find them again, which is extremely annoying. This means that you have to be 100% certain that you want to get rid of someone before swapping out a companion. In addition to your companions, you can have up to 1 henchman. Probably the most commonly used is going to be Edward Garcia. You can hire him at the inn for a handful of cigs, and he is an absolute godsend in the early game. Although in this setting that's possibly not a good thing. You can't change his equipment at all, and he doesn't level up in any way you can affect. But he's a hefty tank that can deal damage. The only drawback is that after a few fights, he will demand more payment. But he is useful from game start to end. There are, of course, others who can join you as henchmen, but they're a touch more situational. The game will award you experience for completing objectives and in succeeding at goals. What's good about it is that the experience isn't locked to combat. You can also get some by sneaking past an area, or speech checks. Even mundane things, like exploring or reading documents, can give you a small amount. It won't really be enough to tip the scales on character growth or anything, but it rewards you for engaging with the game in the ways you want to, really helping avoid the pitfalls of only rewarding one style of play. The game also rewards you with a second kind of experience, but it's a more dubious kind of reward. When you experience something that affects you negatively, you are rewarded with angst. Battles are a good example of this. Accumulate enough angst, and you are forced to choose a drawback. It's a kind of fun system that helps tie in the crushing realities of your situation. It's also good that it gives you a variety to choose from. That gives it a sort of build progression quality, where you can try and plan out and manage the flaws you accumulate. Sanity is a big factor in this game. Seeing a multi-limbed monster, flesh-eating ghoul, or even the comparatively normal acts of random intense violence tend not to sit well with a sane mind, and if not properly managed, you can snap. Your character's belief system is basically their framework for understanding the world. If in conversation you roleplay within that framework of belief, you can claw some sanity back in the face of madness. But then again, trying to hold on to your mind in the face of this insanity may be the most insane thing to do. Or so the game likes to tell you anyway. If you do crack, madness is permanent, which isn't great as it makes you prone to the more psychological effects in combat, and you begin to see strange people in town wearing masks. Upside, though, you get some of your dialogue replaced in conversation with the insane ravings of a lunatic. It crosses out normal dialogue as you scroll over it, in an effect I really quite like. It's not a subtle or nuanced interpretation of madness, but it's fun, and sometimes that's all something really needs to be. Shame though that they don't really acknowledge your crazy dialogue. It's pretty clear what the developers have tried to do is match up the sentiment of the crazy dialogue and the non-crazy dialogue. So if the choice was to agree with something in regular dialogue, the crazy dialogue still agrees, except it was phrased like it was said by a madman. But no one ever recognises that you just started screaming nonsense in the middle of what was likely a fairly mundane conversation up to that point. And sometimes the NPC responses flat out don't match up with what you just said, which is a bit of a pity really for a game that has such a focus on good writing. The belief system isn't perfect. For a system which clearly tries to incentivise roleplay, it can equally disincentivize it. It effectively locks your character into behaving a certain way. If you don't, it's harder to get sanity back, meaning you pretty much have to select the choices which corresponds to your beliefs that you chose at the beginning of the game. If you want to make a different dialogue choice, perhaps because of a specific situation or a character, you're effectively punished for it because you won't get your sanity back. You're also locked into the same belief across the whole game. You can't roleplay a scientist with a rational belief system who through exposure to the occult turns his back on the rational to embrace a world beyond what he could have known otherwise. Or an occultist who after a lifetime of staring into the abyss turns their back and tries to find comfort and safety in religion. The latter issues might be mitigated a bit by the game's relative brevity, and it's also going to depend on how you approach role-playing games like these, and how much you want your role to change over time. If you have an idea in mind going in, it's not going to matter so much. I can't be the only one who knows if he's going full Paragon or Renegade before even starting. However, overall, I think it's a decent addition to the game that does more for roleplay than it does to hamper it. If you have read any reviews on any of the store pages, you'll be well aware of this game's reputation for bugs. I played through the whole game twice in preparation for this script, and encountered a few. Mostly small things I might not even have bothered mentioning. There were, however, a few larger ones that did require restarting. An infinite load screen near the start of my first playthrough, and a second major bug occurred in a fight in a warehouse. Reinforcements flooded into the battle, but they were invisible and suddenly no one could move. Luckily, the game autosaves quite often, and not much progress was lost. I was actually content at the time to acknowledge the bugs, but not hold them against the game too much. But as I went back and tried to record some additional footage, I began to encounter more to the point of frustration. While I still believe it doesn't destroy the whole experience, it's hard to deny that the game could do with a patch or two. Not that it's going to get any at this point. Without spoiling anything, you should be warned about the story. About 3/4 of it is golden. I've already stated I love the writing, but the ending comes out of nowhere, smacks you in the teeth, and wraps up far too early to leave you on a cliffhanger and sequel bait. Bait for a sequel I'm not sure is ever coming. Although I'd love it if it did. And frankly, even all that aside, I don't think it lands very well. Apparently the game was effectively ballooning out of control, and the developers had more content than they could have possibly fit in. So they made the decision to draw a line under the story they had so far, and realise the rest in sequels and follow-ups, which I admit I will commit several dark rituals to see happen. It's a pity they didn't take a bit more time in drawing what they had to a close, and instead went for a more violent cut-off, which brings to mind images of a meat cleaver. You will also find that you just stumble onto quests by just walking back and forth across the same few streets, which is very contrived. It's another odd standout given the high quality of the writing elsewhere, so it's probably best we address the racist elephant in the room before I move into spoiler territory. Lovecraft was racist, even by the standards of his time. Certain themes have made it into the game. There's a minstrel in blackface, and one of the quests is a fateful spiritual adaptation of a short story once described by a Lovecraft scholar as an openly xenophobic polemic against immigration. that does see a colourfully diverse group of robbers just flat out getting murdered. It's certainly a fateful adaptation in tone in that regard, although I'm still fairly new to reading Lovecraft, so perhaps that's an uninformed opinion. It could be both good or bad depending on your stance on how you should adapt works. I'm not going to tell you how to feel about it. You can decide for yourself if that's going to put you off playing. However, I feel the most egregious examples are fairly limited, and you don't have to engage with them as they're not part of the main quest. We're moving into spoiler territory now. If you fear the dark truth beyond this point, skip to the conclusion. As I said, the story is good for the most of it, but it falters at the end. Early on, the player will be given a poem written by the Dismal Man, and you have to figure out what it all means, deciphering it line by line. Each part corresponds to a quest chain to decipher that particular line, and they each deal with one of the ominous entities Lovecraft was known to write about. Aliens, the supernatural, people that aren't English. You know, the terrifying things we share our universe with, which is nice and thematic. It gives the quest their own feel, while still remaining cohesive under Lovecraft's themes. One minute you're hunting through clues and folklore to discover the identities of some ghostly ethereal killers. Next you're building your own brain tank because some incomprehensible, indecipherable alien insists you'll see things beyond imagining by hopping in the back of his intergalactic Ford Transit and taking a ride. Why is he doing this? Maybe he wants the galaxy's most unpleasant chia pet. Being a Lovecraft game, you're going to find yourself in need of the Necronomicon. In a nice bit of continuity from the books, you learn there is a copy available in the library of the local Miskatonic University. Unfortunately, you're unable to take the direct route. Following the clues, and you'll eventually end up in the heart of cult territory, thanks to some advice from a former member, long fallen from their graces. In order to progress through the blasted street, you discover you're going to need some protection. You can either shield yourself with a hazardous environment suit, or a protective spell depending on your character's inclination. Either way though, you're going to have to travel back in time. Perhaps literally, or more likely through some sort of projection to learn what you're going to need. You get to witness that the Dismal Man was responsible for gathering several rich and well-off individuals in the cinema before playing some sort of cursed video that dragged Arkham into its present state. However, little indication is given as to motive. Regardless, back in the present, you make some final preparations and brave the blasted street. Inhabited by interesting people, if you can call them that. Lovecraft wouldn't. I doubt you could even call the Scottish people. Reach the end and you get to fight the boss of the area. A clear homage to The Colour Out of Space, a short story by Lovecraft, which is also set in the town of Arkham, or at least nearby. Although in Lovecraft's rendition, it's still very much located in America. Defeat it and you're prompted with an endgame, no way back past here kind of message. By the way, if you're having a hard time with this boss, often reported as being one of the hardest the game has to offer, a scientist can craft a special beam emitter gun to help. Or you can just stand the guy right here, and they can't get through to hurt anyone on your group once they're on the other side. Beyond the warning message, you enter a non-Euclidean house that keeps changing. You find a sacred sacrificial knife, then you realize you're trapped. Eventually, from a mirror a pair of black lips appears to whisper forbidden secrets of the occult and tells you the ritual to escape. There's probably some not-so-deep symbolism in that Lovecraft would have approved of. You're forced to sacrifice some of your own blood in a fit of madness to perform the necessary ritual to escape. You then wake up in a mental asylum. I hate this. Madness is very on theme for Lovecraft, but the whole main character may or may not be crazy and imagining it all bit is one step above it was all a dream. You meet some familiar faces and some familiar objects. Your goal for this section is basically to craft and then neck down a lobotomy in a bottle before the men in white coats can come and do the job for real. Your way, it's implied you'll live out your life unconscious, dreaming sweet nightmares of Cthulhu and cults. Wake up again, possibly in the land of Nod forevermore, who knows, but instead of the eerie dark streets of Arkham, you wake up in some alien lab, surrounded by less than friendly entities. Luckily, more unfriendly aliens burst in, these are the brain-stealing kind from earlier, and you get to sneak out in the confusion. Seems to be a bit of a war on, and you can use this to your advantage to sneak about. Once you're outside, you'll run into a mute, who can join your party as a henchman. Sneak through a few areas, and you'll come across a great black pyramid. Old Blacklips is back again, this time demanding a sacrifice of one of your companions. This is essentially why the mute was added, so in most situations you will have at least one person with you. Killing one is mandatory, because if you don't, you're stranded on the planet instead. I don't know if you can sacrifice the dog, I refuse to try it. Then you're shot back to the university and Arkham. You get a little about how the true horror is yet to come, but that's it. Roll credits. How abrupt. A lot of the ending section, past the warning message, doesn't really have opportunities to explore, or do much, or even talk to people. Except the asylum bit, maybe. It's all just sort of thrown at you real quick, which is a shame because it sort of avoids all the good bits of the game. Stygian really feels like a faithful adaptation of H.P. Lovecraft's universe. It's dark, eerie, and filled with horrors of both the mundane and alien sorts. The writing and the atmosphere are phenomenal, and the quests are all on theme and fit nicely under Lovecraft's umbrella, due in no small part to them being close adaptations of Lovecraft's own written work. But can I honestly recommend the game as it is? There's enough holes in the code to sink a ship, with bugs frequently occurring. At first I found it easy enough to grit my teeth and bear it to experience more of what the game had to offer. But as the game is quite short and the bugs are quite frequent, even if they are fairly minor for the most part, it gives the impression of a hell of a lot of them. Not to mention that the ending comes out of nowhere, doesn't work out too well, and feels horribly mangled and rushed. It's $16.99 full price. Is that worth it? As cheap as it is, at least compared to a AAA game, I would still recommend you waiting for a sale. It's available on both GOG and Steam. It does have its good parts, but unfortunately it's buggy and has a deeply flawed ending that holds it back from that full recommendation. However, I stand by my assertion that Cultic clearly know the qualities that make a good RPG, and for their very first outing, that seems to be a really good sign for them.